You're watching Let the Quran Speak. I'm Safiyyah, your host. Sometimes when people try to protect the faith, they often make it harder than God intended. And this is condemned in this book, Abd Al-Halim Abu Shuqqah, who says that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was against extremism. We'll be looking at that now. Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We're continuing our series on Abd Al-Halim Abu Shuqqah's series of books on women's emancipation during the Prophet's lifetime, where he compiles hadith and Quranic verses to show that women were free far beyond our imagination, Dr. Shabir. So we're looking at that now, and in particular, we're looking at how some Muslims take things to the extreme, and the Prophet Muhammad seemed to warn against that. So we want to look at that, Dr. Shabir. What are your thoughts on what Abu Shuqqah says?
Yeah, so dealing particularly with this part about extremism, so what he's saying is that yes, it's a good idea to block the means to evil, but people use that as an excuse to impose too many restrictions in Muslim societies. And you're right, the way Muslim societies are now envisioned, what is the ideal Muslim society, when we put that in as the background, and then we look at the narratives which are evident in the Quran and in the life example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we see a very different picture, and the two are hard to reconcile. So it's hard to imagine that the women were so freely interacting with men in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And interpreters try to make excuses for this or that interaction, like, this woman must have been related to that man, and they don't know the exact relation, but they try to come up with something because in our present contexts, it would be unthinkable. So let's look at some of the ways in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, is said to have denounced extremism.
Yes. Should we look at the Quran first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure. In the Quran, in Surah 2, verse 142, there is a verse which is now known to many Muslims, especially after 9/11, 2001. This was much discussed because Muslims were being asked, like, are you extremist or what are you? And many Muslims saw a verse, Surah, in the same one that I mentioned, Surah 2, verse 142, which says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. Thus we have made you a balanced nation. So this is a nation of balance. It is between two extremes. And Surah 7, verse 157 describes the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Among other things, that his mission is to relieve us of the burdens that were put on communities prior to us. So the idea is that, yes, we will still have some instructions, some mandates and restrictions, but at the same time, our religion will be a balanced one. It will not have extreme regulations as we find in some other systems of thought and practice. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, spoke against extremism. In fact, he explicitly is reported to have said, perished are the extremists. In another narrative, he said, this religion is easy. If you pull against it, it will break you, something to that effect. And there's a third narrative as well along the same lines, that we shouldn't be nitpicky or, trying to go into details with regards to the regulation, but we should follow things in a general way. I can add to what he has said, actually, there's more. For example, there is a verse of the Quran that says, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Obey God as much as you're able, which means it's not so totally, completely, as much as you're able. And another narrative from the Prophet, peace be upon him, says that if I command you to do something, do of it as much as you can. And if I prohibit you from something, refrain from it as much as you can. Another narrative says that the Prophet, peace be upon him, whenever he was presented by various options, which are all equally allowable, he would pick the easiest of them, which is counterintuitive from the point of view of devotion.
Yes, because we often think we have to do the hardest thing to show that we are closest to God.
Exactly,
right?
You're willing to make this extra sacrifice. Yeah, and we should always be willing to make the extra sacrifice, but the extra sacrifice is not always demanded, and this is the difference. So when the extra sacrifice is demanded, or when it is needed, or when that is the thing that will produce a great good that is needed, that's what we should be willing to do. But we shouldn't be doing the extra extra for the purpose of doing the extra. We shouldn't be going that taking on undue hardship for the purpose of taking on undue hardship, as if by penalizing ourselves that is somehow going to please God. No, that's not what's going to please God. What's going to please God is when He gives us permission and we make use of the permission. There's a general principle that is otherwise known, and Abu Shuqqah could have incorporated this in the present discussion, but nonetheless, I thought to add those from our own observations.
So, Dr. Shabir, I really like some of the examples that Abu Shuqqah included in his book, including the story of 3 men who came to the Prophet Muhammad. They were all very zealous in practicing their faith. One of them said, I want to pray all night, I believe. I don't remember what the others said, but the Prophet turned to them and said, whoa, hold on here, right? Take a moment. So can you tell us a little bit about that story and maybe other stories as well of people who wanted to go to a bit to the extremes and the Prophet Muhammad stopped them?
Yeah, so in this example, Saf, you're right. The one man said, I'm going to pray all night and not sleep at night. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, I pray at night, but I also sleep. So, you have to allot time for both. And another man said, I'm going to fast every day, day after day. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, well, wait a minute, I fast some days, but on some days I do not fast. And the third person said, I'm not going to get married. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, but I do get married. So he's our prime example. God tells us in the Quran that He has sent the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, لِيُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, so that He might make plain to people what has been revealed to them. So his example is what we are to follow. That's what it means really to worship God, to have this sort of balance. Now, more on this sort of balance, it is mentioned that the Prophet, peace be upon him, kissed his wife while he was fasting, showing that this is permissible. Somebody said, oh, but he's the Prophet of God. So that's for him, not for us.
I found that interesting that was actually in the hadith, because that's something we say now, right?
Yeah.
We say, oh, the Prophet did this, and, but we can't do that because we're not as noble and good and pious as him, right? But yeah, there were 2 examples where the Prophet did something and then people pointed out, okay, we can't do that.
Yeah, that's right. So we can't be more pious than the Prophet. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, corrected that misunderstanding by saying, by showing that what he did was actually permissible and fine for everyone in the religion. On another occasion, it is mentioned, as you indicated, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did something to show that it's permissible. People are kind of like withholding because they say that's good for him, but we can't go that because he's on a special level. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, indicated this is for everybody, right? That's the permission that God has given us. Some people wanted to refrain from getting married, as in the case of that young man, to the extent that they wanted to emasculate themselves, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, prohibited that. He did not allow for men to go that route. And we know from some other religions that people practice celibacy, and this is not something that is taught by our Prophet, peace be upon him. He lived in the world. He enjoyed the good things of the world. He got married. He fathered a child. The child passed away. I mean, he had fathered children before he became a prophet, but even during his prophetic period, he had a child, Ibrahim, who unfortunately passed away. May God have mercy on his parents. So that shows that he lived in the world. Celibacy is not a practice for Muslims.
Even in some other practices, Dr. Shabir, I noticed, like, for example, his companions like Omar or his wife Aisha, they showed that you don't have to be so strict in terms of the way you practice certain things, right? For example, when you're going to Umrah, when you put on your ihram, you don't have to worry so much about like the scents and things like that you're wearing. People focus on very small details about things, right? But
yes,
those hadith kind of remind us that we should be a little bit more moderate in our approach.
Yeah, and just to explain the background behind what you're saying, so everyone might understand. So when Muslims perform the Hajj, as you know, Safiyyah, Safiyyah, we enter into a sacred state. And that sacred state is symbolized in the case of men by the wearing of two unsewn pieces of garment. That reflects simplicity. It reflects renunciation of worldly comforts, and there is a sense of devoutness to God. So we're going to avoid doing frivolous things or unnecessary things, and we're not going to be concerned with our personal grooming. And while we're allowed to take a shower, applying perfume is, and of course we're encouraged even to take a shower, right? Especially you're there in large gatherings, and sweating, and between all of the rituals and so on. But then applying perfume is another stage up, right? And this is seen to be like is sort of a luxury and extraneous. It's not necessary at the moment. And so the pilgrims are not allowed during that sacred state to apply perfume. But then some people wonder, what about if I applied the perfume previously and then the scent of it lingers on? Am I violating that state of sanctity? And Aisha radiallahu anha, may God be pleased with her, the mother of the believers, said, I used to apply perfume to the Prophet's body, and then he would enter into the sacred state and the scent would linger on, and that was not a problem. So that shows that, you have a restriction, but you don't extend the restriction. You don't say, okay, 2 days before I enter into the restriction, I can't apply any perfume because the scent is going to linger on, you see? But if people wanted to go to such extremes, they would. But it's not part of the religion, and people do
in many things.
In many things they apply. They build when I studied Judaism as a religion as part of my university studies, I came across the concept of building a fence around the law. So you have the law which restricts you from going to certain place, and then you build a fence around it, almost like if you have a high voltage tower. Generator, and then you have a fence around it that says "do not touch," right? So, but then it's building a fence around the fence. Some people want to build a fence around the fence, right? So already there are restrictions to prevent us from falling into evil, but people want to build even more restrictions to prevent you from getting to the restrictions themselves, right?
So, Dr. Shabir, can you connect this? How does this relate to neglected women's rights?
What Abu Shuqqah is explaining is that the restrictions which are already there in the Quran and the life example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to prevent us from falling into evil, those are sufficient. Don't try to build more restrictions around the restrictions. Don't go to extremes in what has been prescribed. So if something is forbidden, yes, we should stay away from it, but don't go to extremes in trying to avoid it. And if something is imposed on us as a duty, yes, we should fulfill it, but don't go to extremes in trying to fulfill it. Do it in a reasonable way, because God is reasonable and God is not going to demand of us more than is possible for us, and He's going to excuse human shortcomings and errors because that's natural for human beings. Going outside of the book, somebody put it nicely on a bumper sticker saying, "To err is human, to forgive is divine." So, of course, that's an expression that was meant for people. I think that it means if you forgive other people, you are in some way divine, right? But for our purposes here, it is sufficient to say that God will forgive us because that's what God does. And human beings will err because that's what human beings do. Not that we should. And we don't want it to sound like licentious and we're just saying do whatever you want. But there is a balance, and that should be kept in mind.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Media Hub, the new home of Let the Quran Speak.
Here we spread positivity and good. We help people experience the beauty of Islam and help them appreciate and understand Muslims.
This beautiful building we purchased at cost $2.3 million.
Yeah, we've already raised a third of that money, and with your help, inshallah, we can pay off the rest.
So we're looking for people who can give $1,000 each. If you can be part of the select group, that's amazing.
Otherwise, just please give whatever whatever you can. Every dollar counts.
It's our collective responsibility to share the message of Islam with our fellow human beings. Please help us continue this good work.
It's a sadaqah jariyah, something that will continue to be a benefit to the Muslim community long after Safiyyah and I are gone.
Please support our work at muslimmediahub.com.
Your support is zakat eligible and tax deductible.
May Allah bless you and your loved ones today and always. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.